Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to The Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am Captain Frodo, and I will be your host and your guide along the way. It's great to have you back, and if you are a frequent listener to the show, which I know a bunch of you are, and you haven't already done it, just go into your podcast or wherever you're listening to this at the moment and subscribe, follow this podcast. It would make me very happy. Alright, we are exploring still play and showmanship, and we will be doing so for some time. And as we go, the concept will be grander and grander, and we will see how big a deal and how serious play actually is as we go along. And as we identify more and more and see more and more links between play and showmanship, we will sense the depth of our role in the world as players, as showfolk, as performers grow, and it might hopefully make us feel like we stand on more solid ground. And just a quick recap or synopsis of what we tried to do in the last episode. We set up what we're going to follow on in today's episode and in the next episode as well, where we will be looking at how play and how this play instinct, our drive towards playing, and how always taking anything that happens in the world, a human being can always go, I wonder if it can be done in another way. It's like a juggler. It goes taking anything that's relatively simple and go, I wonder if I could do that in a more complicated way. And there you go. That's the playful aspect, the playful attitude. But what are the human behaviors that actually can be said to be the actual manifestation of this play drive? How do we experience it in the world? So I spent quite a while just talking about and trying to shape that out, and I talked a bit about Ashley Montague and a book called Growing Young, which we will talk a bit about. We talked about it last time, and we're going to talk about it in another chapter where we talk about neoteny and juvenilization, the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, which is going to be important as we go on. But he had a list there in chapter 6 on what he thought was the needs, the emotional or the behavioral needs of human beings, and particularly children. And he had sketched out 27 of those. And I thought that those needs are actually the reason why we need to do them is because he says if we don't get these emotional needs, and they are like love, friendship, sensitivity, thinking soundly, knowing, learning, working, organization, curiosity, wonder, playfulness, imagination, creativity, and on it goes for another 20. So these are needs that he sort of separates out, and then he writes over the sort of 70 pages. He sort of sketches out what aspects of these that gives a good firm foundation for a child to grow and become emotionally sound. And I think that if all these 27 kind of things that we have just described, these needs, I believe personally that the big majority of those will actually be covered if we can be engaged in play. Then I think you will naturally drift into and get to live out these needs. The play instinct will come out through us, and it'll be manifested through these things. We talked about a slightly dark view of childhood, just to go that these sweet things that we've talked about in the list that we need. This is still a bit of a radical thing. There's still people who think that children are just unfinished, unproductive adults that just need to be hushed to be quiet. We don't want to hear a child, but you want to be rushed through childhood so that you become an adult as soon as possible. Something which I think is a crime. But then once we sort of set up all these things, then and that's the kind of context. Then I started looking at the first one of these, because I'm picking a few of the items from that list. I'm sure you can look further into all these and listen to the previous episode and listen to all 27. and we talked about curiosity, talked about several aspects of curiosity and how we could say that it goes from curiosity. This was Eva Heckscher, which we heard in a few episodes ago, talk about our relationship to something can start in a curiosity, grow into interest, and then develop into love. So that's like 3 aspects of curiosity, which I liked and expanded on last time. We talked a bit about poetry and whatnot. And and that leads us on today to get cracking on thinking about learning. Yes, we're going to talk about learning and a few different things. And starting out. Learning is what happens as curiosity persists into interest, insofar as we take in and make part of ourselves what we engage with. By persistently engaging with the task, then we learn to master it in the repetition of the process. We get better at hitting nails with a hammer and sink them into the wood by repeating it, but only if we pay the right kind of attention. If we set out doing a task already certain that we know how to do it and refuse to let reality's subtle and not so subtle clues allow us to alter our actions, then we will not learn. In this way, we could say that all learning has an element of courage to it. To be able to learn, one has to admit that we don't know something and that we would like to change that. In this change lies a transformation, subtle or drastic. When we learn something, the new knowledge or skill changes us. It makes us grow. With new learning, we are all what we were before, but more as well. This is a permanent state for human beings. This growth, continuous growth, we're born unfinished. Of all the species, we are the most undefined. Who we will become is not written in stone or our genes, our desires, or how we act on them in whatever environment we are born into and later move ourselves into, as we choose and find and are drawn towards places. This is all in a constant reciprocal dialogue with ourselves as the arbiters of what becomes part of us or not. What in the environment and whom amongst all our peers, elders and family do we choose to make our teachers? And this determines who we are. I mean, there's obviously an unconscious element, perhaps, if one subscribes to such things, and also then by influenced by teachers and people around ones that one doesn't choose, and that often happens in childhood. So by teachers, I don't just mean school teachers, because many might be in your life as a school teacher, but whether you will truly learn something from them is up to you. You need to allow that to happen. To wonder about something, to have the spark of curiosity ignited, is the first sign that there is something unknown about it. You thought that you knew it, but something revealed to you tells otherwise. Something about whatever it is that's going on that makes you curious about it. It comes from this fact that you know that, what is this? You get an emotion to it that there's more to be known. And stepping into the unknown always carries a kind of risk. Daring to take the step and to meet the unknown with the intention of letting it into you is necessary. In this, our parents and early community is very important. So if those around us shows us ways to interact with the world that gives rewarding results, we build a trust that learning is good. It helps build our courage to open oneself to all the necessary growth. Because one has to learn, to behave like a human. The foundations of this comes through developing the courage and desire to grow. We are born with a disposition to learn. Kids and toddlers can work at a repeat, and they can work and repeat the actions necessary to learn things endlessly. Like I mentioned last time with my daughter putting shells in a little cup over and over again. And as a teenager, as I was into skateboarding, and I just practiced the same moves over and over and over again. Scabs upon scabs upon scabs on my knees. But the kids, as they are doing it, they see us adults and their older siblings or cousins or other kids of different ages around them, and they see them walk, and they want to do it too. We hear that whisper from our ancestor, from our deep ancestors, this feeling, this pull towards it. But the common denominator for all the early learning is that the child needs to want to do it. My daughter was a very early talker. Language interested her. She was curious about language and listened to the sounds of her environment with an intensity and interest that I wish I could match. She was brought up bilingually, where my wife spoke only English to her and I spoke only Norwegian. So whether it was a fact that the mystery of the two whole worlds of sound, which came from the people that loved her the most, that made her interested in language, or whether she was just a language girl, I'll never know. Though, as with most things, it's probably both. She had it in her, and she was interested because that was a rich source. Imagine that, having two different languages being spoken at you, and you're cracking that code, and there's a whole extra world in each of those, in a sense. So my daughter, she would speak in full sentences by the time she was 7 months. I couldn't quite remember that, but when we were looking back at it and talking to my wife, we realized that. And at one of these scheduled meetings with the nurses, when she was expected to only have the most basic use of words, or whatever it was, like 30 or some odd words that they were expected to have, and I told the nurse that I think she has a vocabulary of at least 100, maybe 150. The nurse looked at me like how we look at a child who tells you that their dad is stronger than yours. But then my daughter began to speak with her, and the nurse's mouth pretty much fell open. And the conversation with the nurse, me and the nurse, changed completely after that, which in itself was wonderful. She thought she was dealing with yet another couple who was convinced that their child was the brightest and most remarkable thing in the world, which was exactly what we thought. But that didn't mean that what I told her wasn't true. My girl was a child prodigy in language, and from then the conversation with the nurse went on to the benefits and potential hurdles that we might face with raising her bilingually. And some of those things the nurse said actually really changed my approach. One of them was that she said that when I said that my girl understood Norwegian but often replied in English, and this was a point where the nurse said, you should push her. She told me, it's like, push her to speak Norwegian. So after all, I spoke to my wife in English, so as far as my girl was concerned, this was an option. So learning how to form your mouth and your lips and your tongue to produce completely different sounds that you use in the different languages, it just takes work. So there's a lot to learn. So any child faces this and have to learn other kids, or like I have come to learn that other kids who have been raised bilingually, many of the children can understand the language but doesn't really speak it. So the nurse made me focus on this, and after some time that hurdle was cleared and she began speaking Norwegian as readily as English. But that was that nurse who went from being quite skeptical to actually being very helpful. So my daughter's cousin, on the other hand, my sister's daughter, she came into the world totally ready and excited to walk. So at about the same time as my girl put endless amounts of energy into language, her cousin was consumed by the desire to walk. And soon enough, she was walking. Each child comes into the world with their own inclinations and propensities, some shared by one of those propensities, which is shared by all, is that they want to learn. That's possibly the most important one. So kids are the most avid learners of all living things on earth, since their learning happens in all human domains, not just the physical, but intellectually and emotionally as well. So with this in mind, we can say that children come into the world with the courage to change, to grow, and to learn. And they trust those around them and learn from them. And when I hear people talk about how kids aren't interested in learning stuff, it's usually connected with the stuff that's going on in schools, where the problem, as I see it, isn't that kids aren't interested in learning, because I think they are. It's that they aren't interested in the way it's taught, or they aren't interested in whatever subject it is, or simply that it's all being pushed on them by adults. To really learn something, you must let that thing become a part of you, and that can only happen when you allow it. We allow that from people who we love and who loves us. Our friends, our family, our peers, idols and heroes who inspire us has an influence on us. And we listen when they speak and pay attention when they show us something. Those whom we most readily learn from are those whom we experience as authentic. Those whose actions and words deeply match who they are. When there's deep resonance and genuine passion and enthusiasm in the way somebody tells you about history or of projective geometry, then that thing can become valuable. If they love it and genuinely want to share it with you, if this criteria is met, the hurdle to learning is significantly lowered. The teacher who loves their subject and communicates this will capture the children. Kids, as Einstein put it, has loving interest, desire for truth, and divine curiosity. They have a compass inside them that's pointing towards truth, however that might be experienced by them. And if they sense the truth is shared by a teacher or a friend in the participative process of learning, then learning will actually happen. That takes us into talking about imagination. So, through learning, that's one of those ways. It's like, it's trust and it's all that, and trust comes into many different games. You need to trust in the other kid to get them back you up in the ideas, or if you actually, there's so many layers of this of learning that we will see now more and more deeply reflected in as we keep talking about play. But this sense of learning, of always questioning, always being out and always and sucking it up, and in this relationship where you take it into yourself, I think that's one of those needs and one of the ways that playfulness, we could say that playfulness manifests in the world. Another one that we talked about in criteria 5 is imagination, which Ashley Montague has on his list. So I thought that could be good to talk about. For imagination, kids spend enormous amounts of time exploring the world, not just by studying it like scientists, but by imagining their way into it in any which way they fancy. Like, imagine that the floor was lava. Imagine if all car doors opened inwards. Let's pretend you're a flower and that I am a lamb that's just about to eat you, but then a little prince teaches us how to become friends. If you're trying to teach a kid how to use a trowel to plant some strawberry plants, then you can be sure that before long, that little curved shovel has a trowel, I guess it's actually called, that before you know it, that little spade thing has become a canoe for a race of living plants to sail across a grass-green sea. If you tell them to stop playing, they might stop for a moment, but turn away for a moment, and their exploration of all the ways, practical and imaginative, that a trowel can be, it starts right back up again. Even if they are using it to plant the strawberry plants, they will experiment with different ways that it can be done, and not the least to keep boredom at bay. Kids do not do well with tasks where they need to do the same thing again and again, not unless it's something that they have chosen themselves. Then they can repeat it ad nauseum. That's when it's tainted with the flavor of play. Come to think of it, adults don't really like to do it either, but we still do it. A lot of us do exactly that, repeating stuff that we're not passionate about for 8 hours a day, day after day, and then we call it work. According to Ashley Montague, imagination is, quote, the power of forming mental images of that which is not actually present, or of that which has never been experienced." End quote. It is the ability to see the world, objects and relations differently. Of course, imagination is many things, but for a start, we need to separate out the negative, like it's only in your imagination, from the kind of imagination that allows us to see patterns and possibilities in ourselves and the world. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, who I mentioned a little bit when we were talking about The Clown and the New World in episode 100. Because that poem that I wrote was inspired by the long-form poem of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And Coleridge, who was also a philosopher, in fact he was possibly, during his lifetime, even more famous as a philosopher. But, be that as it may, Coleridge distinguishes between two kinds of imagination by naming the first, this pejorative kind, he calls that fancy, and the other he calls imagination. And fancy is the kind of ability that we have to just randomly connect things. Like I can imagine that I'm flying along in a bathtub with wings made from pure silver. And this is a collage of connections. And this now exists, but it has little relation to reality. Apart from to the observant reader who still remembers Roald Dahl's BFG, where that example actually is picked from. So imagination, on the other hand, is for Coleridge the capacity to detect real patterns in the world. The world is endlessly filled with things and beings, and between them all there are quite literally infinite amounts of possible relations between them. Through imagination, our ability to live ourselves into it, we can predict what will happen or what could possibly happen. This kind of imagination gives rise to our morals, ethics, to the way we understand the needs of a child and see how we can rise to meet those needs in the most enriching ways. We use imagination to live ourselves into other beings, and through it we can get to experience the world differently. And this is what happens when we read a good story. We imagine ourselves into it. Not that we don't know that it is not real, but we allow ourselves to enter into the way it is to be someone else, be it Sherlock Holmes, Anna Karenina, or Princess Leia. In this way, we could say that imagination is one way that we can enter deeper into the world. This is also, in a way, the way that we really learn to understand the world. So, now moving down to another seemingly random selection from Montague's list, I have found the word, playfulness as one of these behavioral needs. So, of course, we should be talking about that. Playfulness as a thing in itself. Because to a child, any piece of information, any object or skill can be anything. It can, of course, be what an adult tells you that it is, like the little spade to plant strawberry plants with. It is a little spade, because that's what the adult said. But it can also be a canoe. Adults very often behave as if they have learned everything there is to know, understood the whole of it, found the best attitudes towards things and how to use it all. Their minds and explanations are so often dead certain, and lives in a narrow band of possibilities and explanations. If you as an adult say to a child, "That is not a canoe, it's a trowel," the child might look at you quizzically as if saying, "Poor you, that can't see, poor you that can't see how it can also be a canoe." They know that a trowel is a little spade. It's not like they can't separate reality and imagination. They just don't see why you need to stop there. As time passes, the child learns, maybe from other kids in the street, that this is what adults do. They name things too small, as we've talked about before. They say, "This is a little trowel," and to them, A spade is a spade is a spade, and it is to be called such because that's what it is. For the adults, but a perceptive kid might ask the other kids in horror, will this also happen to me? Will I too see the world so narrowly when I grow up? And the other kids might say, yes, you have to be careful, because if you're not vigilant, one day you'll wake up and you'll be one of them, the grown-ups. And the world will be only one thing, and you'll spend all day doing stuff that you don't really love. But then another kid, and this is why it's so important for parents to let their kids be in groups of kids, so that there are all kinds of kids with all kinds of ways to see the world. And when the brash kid drops in at the skate park half pipe and isn't paying attention anymore, that other kid will say, isn't that the skate park half pipe brash kid? It's like the kid that says, yes, you'll be one of the grown-ups, if you didn't understand this excellent little audio play that I have. But some other kid will say in confidence that you don't have to become one of them. Just yesterday I was in town and there was a circus there. And in that circus there was a man who climbed a tower of metal bins and cans and then sat down on top of a tiny bean can and put both his legs behind his head. That was his job. Those cans were not garbage to that man. They were a ladder of illumination. Well, anyway, maybe this conversation is a little contrived. Children don't often talk of ladders of illumination. But then again, who knows what the kids talk about when we aren't listening? The thing which is undeniably true is that this imaginary conversation, though, is that there are a lot of people, a certain subsection of us, who are the so-called showfolk, clowns and circus people, who do what they love and who make the practice of not naming something too small. And that to me is the playful way of approaching life by the professional players, such as yourself. Now, a lot of adults lose their inclination to play, and maybe it's weeded out of them by the culture of seriousness which pervades the adult world, as if there was some kind of intrinsic link between seriousness and importance. Is there a link between seriousness and importance? I don't know if there is. I don't think so. I'm going to get back to this later on. And it's my hope that one of the roles that we have to play is that of the adult players, as examples for the children, that for some of us, the way of the child continues. It can continue if you want to. You can be a professional child when you grow up. I felt like I needed to, if I was to say something more about play, after having spoken so much about it, I thought we had to find a playful approach. That was my attempt at that. So let's talk now about sort of picking up on the thread that when we talked about play and connection. So this connection link, another way to express that is to call it sociality. So one thing which I at first was surprised wasn't on Montague's list is sociality. But as I read his description of the 27 behavioral needs, I found that sociality, the absolute and imperative importance of sociality, was kind of baked into every one of the other 27. From the need to love and be loved, which is number 1, to friendship, which he points out is, of course, just another word for love. And much of what kids are curious about is other people, which is another one of his points. And when the flex of their imagination, with the flex of that, they become, amongst other things, fathers, mothers, astronauts, pirates, or detectives, as well as all games and playfulness that has a substantial social aspect. Other of his needs, like honesty and trust, are also directly related to other people. And when he gets to compassionate intelligence, he argues that this could be seen as almost indistinguishable from love. So, with a little bit more of a careful reading of Montague's needs, then we find that love is really all-encompassing, and we find it baked in as ever-pervasive as the canvas a painting is painted on. And love is about sociality, it's about connections. So kids are super social, And I just felt that needed to be linked up with this connection, because I have that in my mind from being singled out by Nuller in his book Clown Manifesto. So kids are super social, and they definitely need to hang out with other kids. Not when they're very, very, very young. 3, 4, 5, they start to really get interested in playing with other kids. And they love to be with kids of all ages, and but adults too. And if the adults can properly see them for who they are, then many adults, anyway, like they love to be with kids, but only being with the adults if they can see them for who they are, in particular at least. Because many adults actually feel superior to kids, thinking themselves smarter, as they long ago have outgrown such childish activities and using their imagination to come up with new ways that reality could be. The adults who no longer laugh out loud every other minute when playing with their friends. These kinds of adults can't make friends with children, not easily. But those who see that children have their own kind of intelligence, their own highly charged emotions, and an endless desire to do everything as long as it's fun, they can make great friends in kids. So those of us who have had the pleasure of being friends with our own kids, we get a strong dose of this. So yeah, some few thoughts on sociality, because as it turns out, this sort of powerful backdrop upon which everything else is painted, our sociality, is actually kind of the human trump card. We are what's sometimes being called ultra-social. And one person who has done this is Michael Tomasello, who in his article, The Ultra-Social Animal, says, he has some really great things to say about attention as well, and about joint attention and all that. So he's a really interesting thinker, researcher, primatologist, I think he also is. But he says in this article, The Ultra-Social Animal, that in an evolutionary perspective, what is most remarkable about human sociality is its many diverse forms of cooperation. End quote. In the way bees and ants are ultra-social amongst insects, human beings are ultra-social among primates. Tomasello believes that during times of distress, when there has been a great environmental upheaval, human beings have been obliged to increase their cooperation. And some of these ecological events have created so-called human survival bottlenecks, which are events where human population dramatically decreases. And if the reduction of the population persists, the graph just falls off to zero like a cliff. But if some of the individuals survive, the graph will drop like a cliff, but then before it hits zero, it will sort of level off, creating a line looking like the silhouette of a bottleneck, hence the name, when it climbs up again. One of the evolutionary speaking recent bottlenecks came after the eruption of the Toba supervolcano on Sumatra in Indonesia. This was one of the largest known explosive eruptions in Earth history. An explosive eruption is the most violent kind of volcanic eruption, and they can expel, apparently, as much as 1,000 kilograms of matter per second of rocks and dust and gas and what volcanologists call pyroclastic material, by which they mean rock fragments that have been fused by incredible heat. So this debris is fired off like bullets and bombs at the speeds of up to 1,000 kilometers an hour. And once it had started, it kept at it for about 2 weeks, shooting about 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash and stuff, which is significantly more mass than what makes up Mount Everest. So all of this ash went across most of the world, and the entire Indian subcontinent was apparently covered in 15 centimeters of ash. And at the moment here now in my hometown, it is covered. Actually, when this is being recorded, it's been a few days now where it's been a lot of snow, and it's amazing just the trouble that gets when you have, if you have a meter of snow that falls just in a few days, of just how much mass is lying around, and thinking this, just when the temperature goes up, it just melts away. But 15 centimeters of ash covering absolutely everything. It's like 15 centimeters of dirt everywhere. And you look at ash after you've burnt something in your oven, and you're going to try and empty the ash out into a bucket or whatever and get rid of it, throw it on the snow, which might help melt it, which is sometimes the fashion. But anyway, you get that ash out. It gets into everything. Imagine that. Every single square inch of your continent, of the entire Indian subcontinent, covered with 15 centimeters of ash. That's a lot of ash. It's hard to get your head around how much that actually is. So when I shovel snow, I'm always amazed at how quickly it piles up into unmanageable hills. And the ash then, it lingered in the air and caused what they call a volcanic winter, which lasted something like 6 to 10 years. And I feel that we have it bad in Norway with our long dark winters, yet at least we get a few months in summer when the skiing gets a bit bad. We know that we get that. But jokes aside, this eruption in Sumatra is thought to have caused a cooling of the earth that lasted for 1,000 years. So imagine that. Cooling period that lasted for 1,000 years, and 6 to 10 years of a winter with no summers in between. Yeah, difficult situations. A lot of people died in that time. So that was a kind of an explosive side trip along the way of our exploration of sociability and ultra-sociality. And then we might be able to, from this, be able to picture what kind of ecological disaster has given our ancestors these unimaginably difficult living conditions. And during this time, when no plant that you relied on would grow, when animals starved, froze, and died off until they became exceedingly hard and to find and to hunt. And in these difficult times, scientists like Michael Tomasello thinks that the pressure to develop our cooperative skills knocked us up several levels in our abilities to cooperate. So that was a big kind of big side trip to kind of make that point of like that cooperation makes us stronger, and in difficult times more cooperation is needed, and that big terrible events like these long winters when after volcanoes is just an extreme example of how we might be forced into cooperating. What's even known in many of these stories is like Cormac McCarthy's On the Road, and a lot of these post-apocalyptic books, films. They are quite dark, and everyone is fighting against everyone. But there as well, the cooperation will eventually outdo the bad guys. That's my thing anyway, and I like those, like John Wyndham, and I can't remember who wrote Earth Abides, but these kind of cozy apocalypses where it's about rebuilding the world, almost like Robinson Crusoe or The Martian, where you're rebuilding something as opposed to just being another book about human beings being terrible to each other. So that's maybe my that little digression there that might be edited out after you finish listening to this. Anyway, now we finally get to the point that I was making about humanity's trump card and superpower. So a team of scientists under the supervision of Esther Herman, which is actually one of the other scientists, that worked together with her was the same Michael Tomasello that I just talked about. So Esther Herman, she administered a comprehensive battery of cognitive tests to a large number of the two of the human's closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees and orangutans, as well as to 2.5-year-old human children. So that's like before literacy and schooling. Very young kids being checked up against chimpanzees and orangutans. And so this was in the journal Science, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals. So it's not just a random paper from the middle of nowhere. And this paper and what this battery of tests, of cognitive tests, comparing the three species, it shows that the difference between the three isn't just that humans are more intelligent, in quotes, which is like often what you might think is like, oh yeah, we're just smarter than our primate relatives, because on the tests, measuring things like spatial understanding, calculation, and understanding of causality, how like cause and effect, there was no massive difference. There wasn't any. It was like a little bit up, a little bit down. And on average, actually, the human toddlers and the chimpanzees performed a little better than the orangutans. But really, the difference was in no way a slam dunk for human toddlers being smarter than primates. And when I first read about this in a man called Rutger Bregman, he's got a wonderful and supremely uplifting book called Humankind, A Hopeful History, which some of you might have heard me talk a little bit about in the second part of my interview conversation with Mac King. I was currently reading that book then. So anyway, I was quite surprised when I read that, because I sort of thought that, oh yeah, we're human beings, we're intelligent, more intelligent than the chimpanzees, we got the big brains, we got this. So I just sort of imagined or assimilated through hearsay and never having properly looked into it, that we human beings, we're smarter. After all, haven't we got like the biggest and the best brains? And then as I think this, I remember that supposedly Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. I scratched my head. I mean, for what it's worth, we human beings landed on the moon, and then had them return to tell the tale. We invented the Rubik's Cube. We carved marble into staggering masterworks of art like Bernini's Daphne and Apollo, and we can cure children with leukemia in about 90% of the cases, and we can do great and difficult things. Chimpanzees can fish ants out of logs with a thin stick, and when you Google special orangutan behavior, the most prominent facts seem to be that they are normally solitary animals. Yeah. When I specifically searched for orangutan use, I learned that they mainly use sticks and other kinds of vegetation, but that they also sometimes use a rock as a hammer. So yeah, that's not nothing. Of course, being facetious here, I have immense respect for our primate ancestors, relatives, their unique intelligence and way of being in the world, much like I have just talked about in regards to seeing children for who they are. But that said, there has to be some kind of difference here. Like, why are we making for whatever the value is of that? But why do we have combustion engines and the orangutans sometimes use a rock as a hammer? So in part, why I got to think so much about this was that Rutger Bregman, in his book Humankind, A Hopeful History, he kept me in the dark about the final domain that the scientists had tested the primates and the human child in. And that dark lasted for about 16 pages, but as is my habit when I read, I'm lining and underlining, and if I find something that I don't understand, rather than just continuing to read to see where this is going, I start to question it and think about it and start to Google and get sidetracked and try to work out what's going on. So, but then as I pick the book back up again, I find that about 16 pages later, in the chapter, Bregman travels to Siberia. Actually, he went to Siberia, but he studied the intelligence of dogs, and he explored developmental biology, in particular neoteny, or juvenilization, which we are going to talk about, and that Mr. Ashley Montague also talked about. So there it is again. Put a pin in that. So we'll talk about that later on. But this person, Bregman, who wrote the book, he was doing all these things, and I'm mentioning that he traveled to Siberia and did all of that in those 16 pages. But then he gets back, to this test where they are comparing the orangutan and the chimpanzee and the human beings, and then he just drops the bomb. It goes like, because there was one more thing which they tested. And the final skill that they assessed was a social skill, the ability for social learning, being able to learn from other people, which basically means that new behaviors can be learned through observation and imitation, and for us humans through deliberate instruction. It can be taught and learned. There's that kind of relationship of, I don't know, but I will look to you, and my ignorance will change and I will grow, like we talked about in the beginning of this episode. So this was where the difference lay. On all the cognitive tests, the chimpanzee, orangutan, and the human performed and scored almost equally well. But in the tests on social learning, the human toddlers just nailed it. Humans scored 100% on all the tests, and the primates, both of them, were pretty much zero across the board. Maybe that's the difference then, just that ability of learning and the level of social learning, our ability for that, more than our brains. So Bregman writes that human beings, it turns out, are ultra-social learning machines. We're born to learn, to bond, and to play. And I've italicized those things in what I'm in my notes, like, because we are born to learn, to bond, and to play. And in those words, we have my whole point summed up: learning, bonding, and playing. Back in our ancient evolutionary history, we find that these three behaviors, learning, bonding, and playing, and their instinctual pull on us, is where we find the foundation, the deep, deep seeds, which at some point sprouted to become the showman that we know and love. It's like learning, and then we're bonding and playing. That's play and connect right there, and then learning thrown in. So this powerful trait of bonding and connecting is such a deep part of us that our bodies and brains have physically changed to enhance our abilities. Michael Tomasello says in the conclusion to his paper that following the change in the ecological conditions of that atomic-style winter, when it's just so much ash in the air that the plants all die, which we explored as the sort of human survival bottleneck that we talked about. And he says, quote, human individuals became interdependent with one another in ways that changed not only their social behavior, but also their cognitive processes, end quote. He says that our species has become so deeply connected that we experience and grasp and interact with the world together as a new kind of being which is made up of many, yet is still one. So Tomasello calls this a kind of plural subject. And in a way, when I was talking about it before, when I say that we created extraordinary statues of out of marble, and we landed on the moon, or we made computers, or we made the combustion engine, like, I didn't contribute very much to any of those things personally, but I maybe that's that what Tomasello calls is that sort of plural subject where we did that. So this is like the many as one. I think of this as the many as one, and this is how I describe one of the perhaps utopian yet real enough for me, the aims of a showman is to make the many into one, to make the gathering of single individuals into one entity, to make the many become one single audience, and make the single spectators become one audience, sharing the same point of attention, being captured by the same story and encountering what is most human in all of us through the connection afforded by the showman. That's a good description of... Oh, no, it's not a good description. I think I rambled there, but I certainly see in Tomasello's work on this ultra-sociality a line of thinking backed up by tests and experiments, something that can be a powerful support for this possibility that my dreamt-up idea of making the many into one, how this could possibly be a real phenomenon. because I do, it's like you spend a lot of time in the beginning there in shaping. Of course, everyone is individuals within your audience, but when you really get them to lean in, when they are interested, when they're not just like caught by you putting something on fire, but when they're actually interested in it, and they lean forward and they start to join in, and you feel like the room is cooking, then I do think that they start to be one thing. Anyway, another way which Rutger, the only person I know of that's called Rutger is Rutger Hauer. That was big in the 80s. But this is Rutger Bregman in his book. Again, he mentions these unique characteristics of our eyes, which we have actually spoken about on this podcast before, like the faithful listener, which might be you, might remember that I talked about this in episode 45, which was called Looking with Cooperative Eyes. So I won't go into too much detail, as those interested can just listen to that episode. But on cooperation, it will suffice now to outline that the way that our eyes look, with a dark pupil in the middle of a white sclera, like it's a black spot with collared spots, in the middle of our eyes, like a dark yolk at the center of a fried egg. This is a unique human adaptation. All the other primates have dark pupils on a kind of dark background. And the special thing which our eyes, in the way that our eyes look, is that it's immediately apparent to others what we are looking at. When we combine this with our capacity for empathy, we can almost not avoid living ourselves into the experience of others. Through this shared experience, we can know a lot about what they're thinking, feeling, and wanting, just by paying attention to what we can see from their eyes that they're paying attention to, like tiny little adjustments of it. And the argument then runs like this. If we were surrounded by enemies or people who would use the ways the direction of our gaze betrays our thoughts and desires, if this giveaway of what we're thinking or where we're looking and all that, if this is abused and used against us, then the white background of our eyes would have been a negative trait. So it would have made it easier for others to take advantage of us, and that would negatively impact on our abilities to procreate, feed ourselves, and stay safe and survive. So since it has happened for all the other primates that they don't have eyes like us, there's got to be something different going on with us. Because this, as I've talked about many times, on at least there in episode 45, that would mean that our eyes should not have evolved. We talked about it earlier too, like with risk. If something is negative, then it wouldn't evolve slowly over time like this. So this, as a beautiful sort of positive conclusion to draw from all of this, is that over tens of thousands of years we must have lived in deeply cooperative environments, where Montague's behavioral needs of honesty and trust and compassionate intelligence and friendship, where these flourished, and those behavioral needs, were met for a long, long time. Because we could trust our tribe so fully and deeply that we could show on the outside, in our face, and specifically in our eyes, what's going on inside us. We no longer needed to hide our thoughts and our feelings and our wants to protect ourselves. And this was true to such a degree that our bodies changed to afford us greater insight into each other. And I speculate that in this time we might also have developed our peculiar ability to blush. We show others that when we're embarrassed, ashamed, or when we find someone attractive. The reasons we blush can be bewildering and hard to decipher, but regardless of what makes us blush, in any given instant, it serves as a signal or a message to the outside. It is not unlike our cooperative eyes, a way to reveal to others what's happening inside us. And this is, this is also ringing that metaphorical little bell there, like, is that not what we're doing? It's like to make outward, make visible, to show feelings, thoughts, and actions to others, and really showing what's going on inside us. That's what poems and stories and connection is all about. So, perhaps we can say then that in describing what made us human, we could say that our relations are more fundamental and thus more important than who actually relates. Of course, each of us is unendingly important as individuals. I'm not disputing that. But speaking from a species point of view, from the entity of Homo sapiens point of view as part of the greater evolutionary process, we human beings are defined overwhelmingly by our relations to each other and to the world, and in every direction, even into the second level of reality made possible by language. In this dimension, an equally infinite amount of relations and connections could be found. Connections everywhere. We shape ourselves and who we are through our relationships to others and the world. When we're cut off from the world through social isolation, through sensory deprivation tanks or through solitary confinement, we lose ourselves. As singular and lonely individuals, the concrete feelings and experience of ourselves become porous and amorphous. And when we are lonely, we feel like we're less in the world, as if our being as individuals kind of decays. It is through our relations we become who we are. We keep each other in the world, and we keep each other whole. It is then an interesting duality that it is through our social and any other relation that we become not just human as a species, but also this is how we become individuals. My relationship to the audience makes me the showman. There rings that metaphorical bell. So as it turns out now, I decided to just make this a longer episode, and that happened. I recorded the introduction, and I thought this was going to be out of 3, but I have now just powered through it all, and we're ready to read just this, revisiting these words of learning, bonding, and playing that Bregman talked about. So we've now kind of boiled this list of 27 from Ashley Montague here now down to these 3 most basic human functions. And Bregman says, quote, "We're born to learn, to bond, and to play." So learning, bonding, and playing. Bregman puts it like that. He says this could define us as who we are as a species. What really defines us and makes us human? Could that be these things? Now I appreciate that there are almost endless abilities and features and ways that what makes us human can be defined. And it all depends on your own standpoint and the kind of conversation that you're having or that we're having, and what kind of story that you want to tell. And as it happens, in a very deep way, I'm telling a very similar story to Rutger Bregman, and his book mentioned ad nauseum now, Humankind, A Hopeful History, is an attempt at pointing out what he calls the radical idea that deep down, we human beings are pretty decent, end quote. He is questioning very persuasively, I reckon, the assumption that we are selfish, greedy, and evil, that we're only that. He does not in any way try to deny that as a species we are like evil, as a species, evil and depraved and terrible things do actually happen. But the wonderful light that he shines on some of these, the so-called evidence, which is held up as proof as for the kind of degenerates that we are, he questions the validity of things like the Milgram's shock machine experiment and the Stanford prison experiment, and even aspects of the atrocities of the Second World War that he casts a new light on, that instead of denying or questioning the fact that it happened, he questions the reasons historians and media and like the stories that they have then drawn from these dark chapters and the conclusions that they've drawn. So the shared outlook that Bregman and myself, which is so beautifully expressed, I think, just to end this on this sort of good note. Of all these manifestations, if we're going to sum this up, what we've just talked about now, I think it's important in this time of fake news and war and propaganda and I don't know what, of people fractioning into different groups all the time, into smaller and smaller fragments. I think it's good to look at things that unites us, and maybe this is this need as well, sociality, of connecting us all together, which I'm boiling these whole things down to. And I am just read The Lord of the Rings. I listened to it as an audiobook read by Andy Serkis, and I can highly recommend it. Andy Serkis, who played Gollum in the Peter Jackson movies, he read out the whole book, and it's an awesome experience for those who are Lord of the Rings fans. But to end up this shared outlook that Bregman and myself then aim for, I think this is beautifully expressed by Samwise Gamgee when he, at the darkest part of their journey to get rid of the ring and all this, then he reminds his lost friend why they have continued their fight against the darkness. Quote, this is Tolkien writing: "It's like the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. I know now folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something, that there's something good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." That's the kind of story that I'm trying to tell about us showfolk, about our origins, and our potential roles as bearers of the light, as illuminated showfolk, as illuminated showmen, carrying the good fight and the hope into the world. This, I think, is what we're doing, and through being playful role models out there, using garbage cans and stuff, stacking them on top of each other, making it into tokens of hope and excitement. Maybe that's why children often like the circus, because they see that hope in it. I hope so. But let's end there, this quite epic episode. So there we have it. What I thought would be 3 episodes is now delivered out in 2. Trying to keep it brief, but I find it hard not to digress. Because as I am going through all of this, I keep always wanting to connect it more directly in towards the more practical kind of stuff. That's why I keep talking about this, the ringing of the metaphorical bell, where I'm going like, can you see how when we talk about play, it continues to be as if we are talking about performance and the attitudes that we need to have to be able to play in this area of interest. We need to connect, we need to bond, and then we have learning in here, which is connected to it all, as we're going to look at these 3, boiling them down and looking at bonding, playing, and learning. These are bonding, learning, and playing. Yeah, very good stuff. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and until next time, take care of yourself and those you love, and I hope to see you along the way.